All right, good afternoon. Welcome to class. We shall be looking at world history, and our emphasis in this course will not just be to discuss the entire history of the world. Rather, we are going to see the progression in human history, and our main emphasis will be how the history of the world affected the church, on how the church affected the history of the world, from the beginning till now, and then we'll do some projection into the future. The study of history is very interesting. It is one of the studies that some people don't like because of the numerous names and dates and events and things like that. But we're going to try as much as we can to make it very simple and interesting. We're not going to go into the details. In fact, there's no study that can go into full details of history because you cannot study the totality of everything that happened in this world. But like someone says that the history of the world is just the biography of great men, it is assumed that once we deal with major events per time, we've already studied the history of that era. And of course, there are people we call the history makers. There are people that the history of a generation revolve around them. The history of a dispensation revolve around them. So once you study about those people, their activities, things that happen around them, it is assumed that we have studied that generation. And that is the level I think God wants his children to get to, where the history of your time, your generation is incomplete, without adding your input into it. Why do we study history? We study history of the past in order to understand the present, and so that we can make adequate projection plans for the future. So we study the past to understand the present so that we can plan for the future. History can be divided into various categories. We have the ancient history, that is the history of the ancient time. We have the medieval history, that is the history of the Middle Ages. It is agreed among the scholars that ancient history ended with the collapse of Roman Empire in 476 AD. And then the events that happened since after that time till the collapse of Constantinople, when Constantinople was overrun by the Muslims, is called the medieval history. And that is between 476 AD and 1453 BC, rather, not AD, BC, 476 BC to 1453 BC. So both ancient history and medieval history were before Christ, so it's BC. And then from the collapse of Constantinople, where you now have the Industrial Revolution and all the events that follow, it is regarded as modern history. And so modern history is what transpired from that era to the present era where we are, which is ICT era. But ICT era has also ushered in what we call post-modern world. So we can say that the world is presently in post-modern world. And we're going to look at that also as we progress. The World History 1, we only cover the ancient history. And then when we get to World History 2, we move into the medieval history, the modern history, the postmodern history, and we will now look at the future of history. And it's going to be very, very interesting. Now, why do we study history? So many reasons, but three are very fundamental. One, history is very entertaining. A lot of entertainment in history is interesting. A lot of historical events that are so wonderful, so nice, and that people like to hear. So entertainment is number one. Number two is wisdom. If you study about 6,000 years history, and then you study, hundreds of human beings. We learn from both their mistakes and their areas of strength, and so it makes us wiser. If you study 100 years history, you are 100 years wiser. If you study 6,000 years history, you are 6,000 years wiser. So history is entertaining, and then history gives us wisdom. And number 3, history enables us to develop faith. Because we're going to see a lot of events in history that there is no logic that could have made those things to happen except the hand of providence, the incursion of divinity in the affairs of men. We're going to see situations that was completely written off, and then from somewhere the hand of providence intervened, things changed, and it's only God that could have done that. And so that helps us to develop faith that if such a thing can happen in history, it can happen now. So those are the things we're going to look at. Now, history revolves around man. And origin of man, we have scientific origin of man, which is evolution, and with all the theories associated with that. We will not go into that. We believe in the biblical origin of man. That is where we stand. And so that is where we're going to stand in the course of these studies. Like I mentioned, there are other scientific origin of man, which several people believe. But as for us, we believe in the biblical account of man's creation. That is where we stand. Now, man is the major person in this world. And so let's look at some of the characteristics of man that makes him unique, makes him different from all the animals and every other creature that exists here. Number 1, man is the only creature that is religious. Animals have no religious lifestyle. They don't worship. So man is the only creature that is religious. That's number 1. Number 2 is the only creature with coded language. I know that there are ways animals communicate, and there are some animals that try to, say certain things, but the only creature with understandable, clear language is man, and that is number 2. Number 3, only man has morality. Only man has morality. Animals can climb their parents, climb their children, produce younger ones. There's no shame in that. So it's only man that has sense of morality. And whenever man degenerates or descend from this level of morality and behave like an animal, we say that he has become animalistic. So man is the only creature with morality. 4 is the only creature that manufactures weapons, that can manipulate things to fight. Animals fight, but they don't fight with weapons. So man is the only creature that fights with weapons. And number 5, animals procreate. They reproduce, but they have no family. So I know there are social insects and all of them that move. There are animals that move in convoy, but the only creature with established family system is man. That is comprehensive, is man. And then number 6, man is the only creature with higher intelligence. Animals are intelligent at their level, but man is the only creature with higher intelligence. It is with this intelligence they can produce aircraft, travel to the moon, and do all kinds of things. So man is the only creature with high intelligence. And also, he is the only one that produces tools to work. Animals can spread seed from one place to another inadvertently, which can grow and become something else. But it's only man that have tools to work with. And then number 8, man is the only one that has shelter. Animals can also create where they live, nest for the birds. And some animals dig the ground where they stay. So, but the only creature with elaborate system of shelter is man. And then man is the only creature that walk erect for a very long time. There are chimpanzees and some families of monkeys who try to walk erect, but it's not for a very long time. So the Homo erectus, the creature that walk erect, is man. And then number 10, man is the only creature that practices agriculture. And then 11, man is the creature with high sense of acquisition. Animals can also gather small things, but man has a high sense of acquisition. In fact, it is said that even when a man runs mad, his sense of acquisition is still working. And that's why we see mad people still gathering things around themselves, still, gathering pebbles, refuse, because sense of acquisition man has it, which of course can also work in a very negative way. People just steal, gather things, even the one they don't need, we keep gathering until they eventually die and leave everything here. So those are the peculiarities of man that is the focal point of history that we want to look at. Now, in the history of the world, we will not, like I mentioned, you can't go comprehensively to know all the details of history. Rather, we'll just look at the civilizations, major events, epochal events that happen through history. And so, we will look at civilization and the beginning of civilization and those who have played one role or the other in the course of civilization. The prehistoric invention of man. Those are the things that man invented early, before all these major advancements we have now. There are some things that man began to invent very early in his documentable history. And some of those things are, number one, fire. Man invented fire on time using stone. And with that, he's able to boil, burn, and do certain things which animals cannot do. So he began to cook his food, whereas the rest eat their own raw. Then number two, wheel. Man produced wheel on time. And every other major inventions like car and all that are traceable to that. Wheel, that is to be able to move his cart from one place to another. And number three, he produced sword on time so that he can use that to hunt after animals. And when they began to spread and began to fight, then they were using all these weapons to fight one another. And then spear, these are earlier things that man invented. Bows and arrow, these were the things they were using to fight in those early days. Nothing like gun, nothing like machine gun and all these new nuclear weapons, biological weapons. No, they were just using all these things to fight of expansionism and all that. Then boat, since about 70% of the earth's surface is water, it needed to conquer water to be able to move from one place to another. So man came up with boat for him to be able to move over the water to somewhere else. And then language. Of course, we're going to discuss that later on. We began to have language that is even documentable, passed from one generation to another and all that. And then domestication of animals. He began to domesticate some animals to live under his control at home and all that. So these were the early inventions of man at the beginning of his journey. And then there were places that got civilized very early, where history has account of. And some of these places, some certain things are peculiar to all of them. And there are 4 basic things you find that aid civilization anywhere. Because in fact, these things are still real till today. Number 1, any place that was civilized, the natural environment was very good. And so number 1 is natural environment. And then number 2, agricultural settlement. If there's a place that was civilized, after the natural environment, there was agricultural settlement. And then number 3, good political arrangement, how the people organize themselves arranged themselves well. And number four, mental advancement. They began to, task their brain and were developing gradually. So the first area that was documented to be historically civilized is what we call the Sumerian civilization. Sumerian civilization. That is in the present, in also the place we call Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the place eventually became Babylon, and presently now is around axis of Iraq, Iran, that area. So that was the earliest center of civilization. It's also agreed that that was where the Garden of Eden was, because of some things that we're going to talk about now. Now, the Sumerian civilization, these four cardinal points we mentioned were present. Number one, natural environment. In the Garden of Eden, you see that there were two major rivers, River Tigris and the River Euphrates. So these two rivers were present in Sumer, and so there was enough water for the people to drink, take care of their animals, and also use for agriculture. So the environment aided civilization. The natural environment supported civilization. Number two, agricultural settlement. Once the natural environment is good, the next thing is agriculture. So people were able to do agric work. They were planting. And of course, you know that even from the creation of Adam, God gave them instruction to till the ground, to plant. So agriculture was a profession that God handed over to man, even before he sinned. So agriculture preceded sin. So it's a normal thing that people are expected to do wherever they are. In fact, some have analyzed even the creation in Genesis, that God himself arranged the sequence of civilization. Number one, he created Adam and made him to be very intelligent, powerful, innovative. So they say that the number one thing that God demands is human development. That is the greatest level of advancement any people group could have. And that is what God himself did in Genesis chapter 2. And then number two, he gave them water. And you know that water is the most essential, material on earth. You need water to survive. All human beings need water, all animals, all plants. So water is also a money spinner. Water brings money globally, and water is one business that can never go off. There won't be a time people will not need water again. So God, after human development, he gave water, and then also he gave agriculture. He commanded them to till the ground. You need water to till the ground. And so God himself was indirectly telling them that human development, if any nation is going to be great at all, take human development very seriously. Number two, make use of water effectively. Waterways, conquer your sea, conquer your ocean. There are a lot of nutrients down there that God has given to man. And then number three, don't joke with agriculture. And then, so if you study that place, the last thing God gave to man was natural resources. And so that means that any nation that depends on natural resources, which is the last, is going to be the least. So human development, usage of water, proper agriculture, the natural resources come last. And so in Sumer, you see proper agriculture was taking place. And number three, there was a proper historical setup. There were great kings around that place that were doing great things. So the earliest ones that were documented, number one, the king Urukagima of Lagash. He was documented to be a king that civilized his people. That's the very little thing we know about him. And then King Sargon I of Akkad, just within that Sumer. He was also known to be a great conqueror who conquered the surrounding places and then made his own place to be civilized. Then, so there were several kings like that. King Gudea, who prospered the people, and then King Or Engor, the king of Ur of Chadi, that's the place of Abraham, who built great palaces and great houses, even as at that time. And then finally, the most prominent of them all was King Hammurabi, who gave the people law, who gave them a proper setting of environment, which is like the ancient banking system. And many of the things you have today, he had the ancient version of those things. And so there was great civilization, and Hammurabi's world was a developed world. And fortunately, Abraham lived under the time of Hammurabi. And so when God asked Abraham to leave your people, leave your country, go to a place I'm going to show you, it's a crazy command. It was like God telling somebody to leave New York of today, Paris of today, London of today, Madrid of today, Beijing of today. God telling somebody to leave all those things, all the advancement, civilization and pleasure, and then to move to a place like, let's say, Borno State in Nigeria or Niger Republic. That was the exact thing that God did with Abraham. And so for Abraham to agree to leave that place and go to a place that God has not even mentioned, Abraham knew that where he was living was the best globally. There was nowhere else. And God said, leave the place and you will go somewhere else. So it takes faith for Abraham to believe that where he was going, since God is involved, the place will eventually become great. And today now you have the nation of Israel, which is the world leader in innovation, in advancement and anything, and so many other things. So Abraham was spiritually seeing that in the desert. Anyways, let's leave that. So there was also mental advancement in Sumer. Writing was developed first, cuneiform system of writing. Invention of wheel was there. Then they began to also, invention of ark, the one we use in our building. So that one also started from there. Then science started from arithmetic, addition, subtraction, measurement, weight, science of Zadok, and the first ancient calendar. These were all things that came up in Sumer. So scholars believe that that's the center of ancient civilization. If we go to the Bible, it was in this same place man built a tower that will reach God. And the leader of the group at this time was called Nimrod. He was a black man. And so historically, the leader of the first civilization was a black man. But when he led the people in rebellion against God. So some scholars are of the opinion that maybe now, I'm not saying that's what happened. So that's just the opinion of some scholars. That could it be that because the black man who was the first leader of the world led the people against God, then it's difficult for black man to lead again. It's just an assumption. There's no theory to back that up or to support it. It's just an assumption. So that's that about the Sumerian civilization. So we're going to take Egypt, and then next class we will continue. Egyptian civilization happened almost the same time this one is happening. So in fact, there are scholars that believe that Egypt is the center of civilization. So why some hold on to Sumer, the other hold on to Egypt. So and then there's the third group who believe that both of them were happening the same time concurrently. Now, Egypt also enjoyed a good natural environment. River Nile was there. We say no Nile, no Egypt. And because of Nile, the ancient irrigation system started in Egypt. So Egypt was also involved in agricultural settlement, which is number 2 in our components of civilization. Then in the political arrangement, Egypt went through different system of government. Number 1, between 3200 BC and 2300 BC, there was pre-dynastic period. There wasn't Pharaoh that time. Each community have their own leader. There was no central figure. So that's the way it was. Then in the Old Kingdom, which is 3200 BC the pre-dynastic period was 4000 BC to 3200 BC. While the Old Kingdom is 3200 BC to 2300 BC. Within the Old Kingdom, instead of having kings everywhere, they now had Pharaoh, who was the central leader. And that was the time of advancement. That was the time they really grew, because there was central leadership. So that was the time they began to do so many things that Egypt is known for today, building up so many things. Then, after this era of great advancement under Pharaoh, people felt that the Pharaoh's government was too draconian, and so there was a time when the power of Pharaoh was reduced. So there were little kings here and there, which we call small pharaohs, took over their own jurisdiction, but there was no progress. That was between 2300 BC and 2100 BC, about 200 years interval. Then we have the Middle Kingdom between 2100 BC and 1700 BC. During this Middle Kingdom, Pharaoh was able to gain power again and gain control, over the people, and then there was advancement also. Then, after this period, something now happened. It was under this period that Joseph got to Egypt. And it was under this period also that Joseph interpreted dreams for the chief butler and the chief baker. And then Joseph discussed with that man that when you are restored back to your office, remember me. Now, but the man forgot Joseph for 2 years, according to the Bible. Then I'll tell you the reason now. If the man had remembered Joseph at that time, and they brought Joseph out of the prison, he would have still just become a slave in Egypt. The reason is this. The constitution of Egypt does not allow a foreigner to hold any office. In fact, even if you are an Egyptian, you cannot hold office in the palace except you are from the household of Pharaoh. The system was so bad that a Pharaoh has to impregnate his own daughter, and the son that comes out of that is the only one that is eligible to be a Pharaoh. So if you are a son of Pharaoh, as at that time, you cannot be Pharaoh. Because it is believed that Pharaoh must produce a full blue-blooded son. That is, both the mother, the father must be from main lineage of Pharaoh. So it was an abomination, but that was the practice. And when God is involved, as I mentioned, that history increases faith. The Pharaoh in the time of Moses was barren. The daughter couldn't produce a son for the father. And so that daughter was desperately looking for a son. And that was the Pharaoh's daughter that saw Moses and then brought Moses and made Moses our own son. And that was what qualified Moses to be the next Pharaoh if everything was left in order. It was because of that practice. And so there was no magic that could have made Joseph to be a prime minister in such a place. But because God controlled the affairs of history, in 1700 BC, there was a group of barbarians called Hyksos. This Hyksos invaded Egypt, which was the first time Egypt was invaded. Otherwise, Egypt was impregnable up to that time. But because God wanted to work out something, there was something God wanted to do. So the Hyksos overran Egypt and destroyed Pharaoh and took over the government. But they now made them to know that you have taken over government, but the law here is that a stranger must not hold office. You are strangers and you want to make yourself leader. You can't be leader here because of the existing law. And so that particular Pharaoh, now in order that Hyksos man, in order for him to become Pharaoh, he now cancelled that law. The law was promulgated that henceforth anybody from anywhere can now hold office in the palace in Egypt. And so because he has done that, he was able to become Pharaoh. It was that particular Pharaoh that had a dream. And when God had already broken the law that would have stood on the way of Joseph, then the man had a dream. And then the chief butler said, hey, I remember my fault today. There was a man when I was in the prison. He's a dream interpreter. Let's bring him. and he's going to interpret this dream. That was when Joseph was now brought out. And when Joseph came, he interpreted the dreams of that man, and the man pronounced him the prime minister, because there was no more law that stopped a stranger from holding office. That was how Joseph became prime minister in Egypt. Now, the Hyksos were in charge of government, and eventually Joseph went and brought the Israelites also. So the Israelites and the Hyksos were the one in charge of government in Israel. In Egypt rather, in Egypt. While the original Egyptians were slaves in their own land. After years, the Pharaoh, indigenous Egyptians, revolted. That time Joseph had died and all those things had happened. They revolted. When they revolted, the son of Thebes, that is from the original lineage of Pharaoh, became Pharaoh. What do you think will happen? Then the Egyptians who had been slaves became liberated. And so that was why they turned against the Israelites and made them slaves also. And that's the one the Bible says, another Pharaoh came up who knew not Joseph. So, this particular Pharaoh initiated what we call the New Kingdom. And it was that New Kingdom that was in existence till the time of Moses. It was this new set of Pharaoh that one of them, Ramses, released the children of Israel and eventually got drowned. The interpretation